Essayette number 10 and episode 10 in our video series here is entitled Drama. Since it's not too long, I'm going to read it straight through and then pick up on one good question that's asked along the way. Drama. The entrance of this term and its adjectival form, which the reader may already have noticed, should not pass unremarked. At the outset, we defined opera as theater through song, and noted that as long as any kind of theatrical action and any kind of song were present together, opera could be said to exist. Opera has developed around the same theatrical form as have its sister stage arts, the drama. Conflict is the essence of drama and generates its action. But theater does not have to be drama. It is possible to envision and aspire to a life without conflict, and to represent such a life and aspiration theatrically, and therefore operatically. The difficulty seems to be that when life has been cleansed of conflict, we cannot recognize it. Such a life is a vision, a fantasy, that can be imagined as a fixed moment, but not as an ongoing reality. We don't believe in it, and frankly aren't interested in it on a sustained basis. We are interested in, excited by, drama. We believe in life that contains conflict and cannot in all honesty say that a life without it would be functional or desirable. Of course, we strive to resolve our conflicts, and on a case-by-case basis we do. Each drama ends in resolution, agreeable or not. Then it is time for the next drama to begin, for conflict to assert its survival. It is because conflict survival is undeniable that drama is the dominant form of stage representation. Even the rituals and pageants that do not present dramatic action in an overt and immediate way are traceable to dramatic origins or are meant to show the resolution of a conflict. Music is better suited than theater for evasion of conflict. It can flee into the purely lyrical, the descriptive, for fairly extended periods in the hands of a master who is so inclined, Bellini or Berlioz, Delius or Messiaen. Its abstract and sensory elements make the ascription of meaning treacherous, and thus yield at least the potential for non-dramatic interpretation. Even so, very little Western music is not suggestive of drama in harmonic tension seeking resolution, in structural dialectics to be worked out, in color variations and contrasts tending toward coherence of design. On the stage, conflict is embodied by characters whose objectives are at odds, and its progress is shown through actions undertaken by the characters in pursuit of their objectives. It is important to understand that in dramatic terms, action refers not merely to physical behavior, but to any means employed by a character to further an objective. Dramatic characters are never not in action. Since conflict is usually present within individuals as well as among them, there is an inner and an outer aspect to their actions, and their courses toward their objectives are seldom simple and direct. Operatic music accomplishes its mission by setting forth character conflict in theatrical terms, and its integrity lies in that. While it has incorporated at one time or another most of the structures known to so-called absolute music, these must remain subordinate to dramatic purpose in opera, where scene structures and the arcs of character action must determine the musical progression. Opera has therefore contrived its own techniques of musical conflict for the presentation of opposing actions, inner and outer actions, action and description, action and emotional state, either in alternating or overlapping structures or in perfect simultaneity. These techniques and the psychological realities they reflect are available to no other art. Operatic singing, too, must possess a dramatic vitality that goes beyond pure lyrical expression. This is true partly because it must project in large spaces over an orchestra, but more importantly, because it must convey urgency of action and intensity of emotion. A struggle to overcome, a striving to fulfill passionate needs threatened by denial is inherent in operatic vocalism. It might be said that feeling, action, and obstacle must all be present in the tone itself. Like all arts that subscribe to classical precepts, operatic singing seeks to contain the conflict within the form, to show grace and mastery of execution so that the character's struggle is not perceived as the artist's dysfunction. And operatic voices must be capable as well of the transcendent, triumphal gestures that crown so many of the form's most powerful moments. But they must convey the ongoing impression that the issue is in doubt. Their tensions must evoke the atmospheric essence of all drama, suspense. It is because of drama, of the stories of characters in conflict, that operatic music comes into being. Music that does not find a means of dramatic fulfillment is not good operatic music, whatever its other qualities. And the same is true of its performance. All right, that's the conclusion of the essayette. So let me go back a couple of paragraphs to the question. It's from Steve, who picks up on this observation of mine that while opera's way of presenting dramatic conflict does sometimes use techniques that are also found in other musical forms, it has developed its own techniques for the presentation of musical conflict and psychological reality, and that these are available to no other art. And concerning that, Steve asks, quote, "Is it possible to discuss in brief some of these techniques?" unquote. I'll try, though the in brief part is the tough one, since like most of these questions, this one opens up whole avenues of thoughtful discussion. First, I should make sure we understand that we're talking about opera that has a dramatic core. As I'm sure you're aware, there are developments in both music and theater that head in other directions, what I term state of being music, or sonic experience music, or so-called post-dramatic theater, etc., that seek to erase conflict and narrative itself, and therefore dramatic progression itself. While the operatic forays in these directions have stayed outside the mainstream, their directors and designers, who are sometimes also their auteurs, bring their ways of working, their ideas about what music theater is supposed to become, back into our classical repertory, to the great disadvantage of the latter. None of what I'm saying here is applicable to those supposedly advanced forms. I don't include them in my definition of opera, which, as you'll recall, begins with the commission of a sung dramatic action. The obvious thing to say about opera's musical structures is that they have to be theatrical. They have to add up to scenes that move the stage action forward. So their structures have to be cinetic structures. That's true of all opera. But in E19 opera, this movement of the scenes is usually toward a tragic end. We have a few happy end pieces of a sort we might call shadowed comedies, but the great majority of the canonical masterworks are tragedies. And I'm always intrigued by how different that is from the dramatic progressions of the great, quote, pure music, unquote, instrumental forms of the same era, the symphony and the string quartet. Those typically have these four movement structures, the first movement being muscular, containing conflict, struggle, following which the middle movements don't really continue that, but instead comprise one that's contemplative or ruminative, descriptive rather than active, then an up-tempo one that's merry, carefree, dance-like, or something along those lines, and finally, there's a fourth movement that either takes up struggle again, but then resolves it in a triumphal or transcendent way, or else proclaims triumph or transcendence right away, and then layers on, perhaps with a passage along the way that presents an obstacle, but then rises above it. There are exceptions and complications, but as an overview, I think that's fair. And those forms developed compositional techniques that furthered that progression, which is toward a happy, self-affirming conclusion. I sometimes puzzle over this, that the same culture, at the same time, produced these bodies of work in musical languages that are at least pretty closely related, that head toward these seemingly opposed destinations, almost as if to say, you can have the triumphant, the self-affirming, while dealing with musical forms that stay in the abstract sphere, where they can't quite be defined in real-world terms. But as soon as you move over here into the concrete, where we traffic not so much in human fate at large, but at human fates, individual human lives, you must concede the fact that mortality always wins out in the end. And because of conflict, the clash of human wills, sooner rather than later. Well, this may seem like a digression from Steve's question, but the fact that our dramatic progression is toward tragedy means not only that its pervasive tone is different from that of the pure musical forms, but that certain qualities, notably suspense and foreshadowing, which are certainly present in the other forms, will be emphasized en route to the inevitable destination. Okay, let's take a look at a few of the ways opera rights worked out to move action forward that are distinct from those of both instrumental music, because they must fulfill the demands of scenetic events, and of the spoken theater, because they must accommodate musical structures. And all of this you know. I'm not doing any heavy lifting analysis here, but perhaps I've not thought about in this context. So, the aria. Think especially of two of its forms, the ABA aria and the double aria. In the ABA form, so fundamental to Handel and all the opera seria opera rights, we have either an A section that promises action, rescue, vengeance, atonement, whatever, with a B section that expresses some reservation. Then the A section again, casting aside the reservation. So typically fast, slow, fast. Or we have the reverse, an A section expressing a deep sentiment of mourning, dejection, hopeless love, so forth, with a B section trying to rise above that, then A returning to restore the original down feeling, typically slow, fast, slow. Or, a little later, the double aria, that we often call aria and cabaletta, with a first section that works through some emotional situation or expresses a longing, or perhaps recounts some tale we all need to know, including the person to whom it is addressed. And then the second section, which is in effect an aria d'azione, declaring an action about to be taken, and often is seconded or commented on by a series, a chorus of supporters. Or think about the way opera handles the duologue and duet forms. I don't mean the love duet, which sometimes moves action along, but usually just declares a situation that will give rise to action. But the duologue / duet of opposed objectives. Sometimes this proceeds with each character presenting his or her case in music that belongs only to him or her, but quite often it presents antagonistic objectives in essentially the same music, possibly with a modulation or tempo change, but with the performers left pretty much in charge of using shared music to express their contrary feelings and intended actions. A clear example would be the second half of the Lucia Enrico scene in Lucia di Lammermoor, and in fact the first half has developed this way too, which Enrico begins with a propulsive figure, Se tradirmi tu potrei. He's driving the scene with the urgency of his need. And Lucia answers with the same tune, but in an entirely different emotional context. And then this leads into actual duet developed out of the same materials, all still in conflict, all still yet contained within this symmetrical musical structure. There must be 1,000 occurrences of that in 19th century Italian opera alone. And these two-person exchanges build on up into multi-character complications, all the way to the great ensemble finales we have all the way through the Romantic era. If we want to see a whole bunch of these storytelling techniques laid out end to end, Il Trovatore makes for an ideal specimen. After Ferrando's backstory narration and the choral reply by way of prologue, we have Leonora's first double aria, first the narrative, Tace alla notte, that is exposition infused with romantic longing, followed in the fast section by a declaration of live or die for love purpose. Then you have the scene-ending trio, literally a combat, all the characters at odds with their own musical gestures, except for a passage where the protagonist couple sing the same tune, but not to the same words or with exactly the same intent. Then, and I'll be skipping over choruses here, which serve to place us in a scene or establish some situation, and which obviously are not found in the other stage forms or in other musical forms, at least with the same function. Though I will note that the Anvil chorus breaks off for a two-strophe song that picks up on the narrative of the prologue, carrying it forward from the POV of someone directly involved. Then we have the long Azucena Manrico scene, which consists of a highly fraught, highly suspenseful narrative, the condotta, which continues that same story and brings it into the present, whose action is to make the other party understand a situation of great emotional significance and therefore be ready to act on the understanding. And the other characters answering narrative, mal reggendo, in which he tries to explain himself. Then the interruption with a piece of news that exchanges the whole direction of the scene, and alternating statements to alternating melodic and rhythmic forms, and finally the brief duet coda with the characters emotionally torn, but the music resolving the whole sequence. Well, I won't go through the whole opera, but I will point out that we have 3 more double arias, the Counts, Il Balen and Per me ora fatale, Manrico's, A si ben mio può essere, very much a piece of foreshadowing, and again, after a direction-changing intrusion, Di quella pira, and Leonora's second, D'amor sull'ali, and the Tu vedrai, if it's not cut, all in the same pattern, though the Count's cabaletta develops and subsides in an uncommon way, all involving choral participation, and each serving to turn the plot in some new fatal direction. As I say, Trovatore is a particularly clear specimen, and Lucia too. They both have libretti by Camarano and are laid out very similarly, and it is exactly this sort of serial clarity of structure that composers, including Verdi himself, sought in time to elaborate in less obvious ways, or even dispense with altogether. Though, if you look at the final scene of Siegfried, for instance, you'll find several of these duologue duet ideas still at work. These are only a few of the ways that opera distinguishes itself from other stage forms, other musical forms, to fulfill itself as drama. There's one more I'd like to mention that we don't usually think of as a musico-dramaturgical device, but is actually the most important of all of them when it comes to realization in performance. That is the singing voice itself, as developed over the centuries to meet operatic demands. And we haven't had occasion much to speak about singing per se in the course of these episodes. It's one of several important topics, that are discussed at length in the book, but don't come up much in this first part. So I'll expand a little here on the one paragraph devoted to voice in this essayette, where I spoke about, quote, feeling, action, and obstacle all being present in the tone itself, unquote. Beyond the things we quite properly pay lots of attention to, like the legato, the messa di voce, and so on, there is one aspect of operatic vocal technique I'd like to briefly address, because I believe it is the element that is most grievously lacking in operatic voices today. I'm sure many of you who have read much of my writing, and I gather I find some agreement on this among the boot camp mentors, but I don't want to speak for them, have heard about enough on the lack of attention given to the chest voice, especially among women. So I'm not going to talk about that, at least in exactly those terms. Instead, I'll start by suggesting that if we are speaking of sung drama, as we have been, and if drama necessarily moves forward through actions, and the actions inevitably lead to conflict, then a dramatic voice must be one that carries the sound of conflict within it. That must at least be latent, so that we sense its presence. And that would need to be true of voices of all types, sizes, categories, not just the ones we label dramatic, Helden, di forza, and so on. If a voice is representing a dramatic character, it must sound active, and it must have in it a readiness for conflict, for opposition. This may sound as if it contradicts the goals of ease of emission, of freedom and ductility that we all want for a technically advanced voice. But it doesn't. For just as drama proceeds through a kind of dialectic, so do all the systems of coordination in the body, including those of voice, become capable of energetic, efficient action through paired antagonisms, through an initiation of movement by the contraction of one muscle or muscle group, and then a control of the movement by the holding action of the opposed muscle or muscle group. When this coordination of antagonisms is strong and balanced, it is efficient and gives the feeling of ease and freedom. We can think of this unit of coordinated action as a cooperation between push and pull, energy activating outward movement, a pull holding against it. And that's an okay image for many purposes. But in working terms, it's more accurate to speak of an activating pull and a hold against it. If the activating pull has only a little energy behind it, only a little action will result. If the pull overcomes the hold, a larger but uncontrolled action results. And the only way to regain control is to reduce the activating pull, which limits the range, the stretch of the action. It's little again, though under control. If the hold overcomes the activating pull, it blocks the action, slows or stiffens it. Now it's not only little, but also stuck, jammed up. So the only way to create large, rangy, elastic actions is to ensure that all the coordinating muscular systems are strong and in balance and able to remain that way, to stay elastic and responsive under rapidly changing movement requirements. What I hear missing in the great majority of contemporary voices, of both sexes and all types, is what I'd call resistance. The equalizing resistance against the energy being thrown at the coordinations that generate tone. It's missing not only in the big climactic moments that call for an exciting fortissimo, but in the attempts at mezzo voce, which have none of the sense of suspenseful containment, of the tensile quality that suggests something being held within. And the connection between this and the lack of lower register development we are all bemoaning is this: applying every bit as much to male voice as to female, even though we hear it more readily in the female. If the functions of the lower register have not been activated and fully developed in relation to their potential within the voice's framework, then the holding action of that register will not be ready to provide the resistance of the outgoing energies being directed at the voice as pitch ascends or volume increases. It also will not sustain the integrity of the vocal position as activating energy is reduced, as in a diminuendo. The balance of tensions in the interplay among strong elastic coordinations cannot be maintained, and one has a choice between big tone, that is loose, erratic, and approximate, and not evenly calibrated up and down the scale, or tone that is neater and more consistent, but falling short of making dramatic utterances of any significance at any dynamic. Which, with exceptions far rarer than they were in my own lifetime earlier, to say nothing of the lifetimes of my forebears, is where we are today. The next episode, number 11, will be devoted to concepts.